Okay. Didn't realize I had to click that one spot.
I'm glad you got here, because what was I going to say if you didn't arrive?
Good morning. You guys are live. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Tamara. How are you, Nina?
I'm fine. How are you, David?
I'm hanging in there. It's like it's another beautiful day. That's
Yep.
really nice.
Yep.
Go out walking again.
Yep.
I did a lot of hills last night. My legs are sore.
Okay. So that's your excuse for being late this morning?
I had to click the start camera or something like that I missed. It's below my screen. I go down and sometimes I miss it. Okay, so welcome everybody, and this is a Tamaraless show, but everybody who's been tuning in regularly knows that Nina is an occasional visitor and guest. And when Nina's on with me, it means we're going to talk about white people a lot.
Okay. Because we are white people.
Yeah. Well, and so we thought we would just have a conversation the way we usually do, and kind of address the topic of what does solidarity mean in this day and age, and how can we extend it and deepen it, and what are some of the limits and ways in which we could strengthen our connections and ties, first of all across racial lines, but also in just in what ways does that change the whole dynamic of our society? So I don't know. Do you want to talk about your neighbors and start out with that?
Sure, I can start out with that, and I'm just trying to speak in a way that's kind of general about this. But I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. There is a Black family that lives up the street from me, and they've been here for a number of years at this point. I'm talk to them and know them as well as I know any of my neighbors. But what happened about a week ago was that somebody left dog poop in their mailbox. And their sons, their two boys, were the ones who found it when they went out to collect the mail. And I heard about this, I think it was the day that the arrests had been made of the two white men in Brunswick. So it hit me harder even in a way about what happened with my neighbors. And I worried, because you and I have talked about this, that it sounded like I was trivializing. But all of a sudden I was feeling maybe some of the way my neighbors could kind of feel about things too, of not being sure, why did this happen to them? And my first thought was that they were singled out because they were Black. And I can't say that that's not true, and I can't say that it is true. What I can say is that in this predominantly white neighborhood, I have not heard of that kind of incident happening before. So it was easy to kind of go to that place, and it bothered me, because my thought was, if somebody's willing to do that, what else are they willing to do? And what are they paying attention to about the family? And it made me sorry that this happened to them. I talked to the dad in the family and told him how sorry I was about it. And I said it to the boys too, because he was out playing football in the front yard with the boys. And we chatted, and I don't want to go into a lot more detail, I think, than that, but just that it was a place that you and I began talking about some recent incidents and about solidarity. And what does that mean?
I think that your point is the sense of ambiguity not really knowing is a really important thing to keep in mind. That one of the ways in which one of the, I guess you could say, simplest ways of expressing solidarity with people of color, and particularly African Americans. And we should just say that you live somewhere in the Atlanta area. This is we're locals, and so. But one of the things is to keep in mind how much the gaslighting, as it's called, is a part of the racial inequalities that exist. This whole idea that European Americans who think and act white, and that's my formulation, as you know, Nina.
Yeah.
I don't think people are white. I don't think it's part of their being. I think it's a bunch of habits that are deeply ingrained, historically derived, but are really behavior patterns that, for working class whites, are actually really self-destructive. But one of the things that thinking and acting white is all about is denial. Denial of your own situation as a working person, and denial of the motivations for a lot of actions that are I'm not sure how to put this, intentionally or as part of the system, are designed to put Black people and other people of color down, to keep them in their place, as the old language used to say it, and then to deny it. I'm not a racist.
Right, right.
And I think that some of the discussion about it, that these people have a different definition of, those people who say that have a different definition of race, of racism or white supremacy, in that it's personal animus.
Right.
And that's a good point to make. But in fact, I don't think it's the major aspect of it. The major aspect of it is to keep the rest of us guessing, and gaslighting us. And so the more we as European Americans who are trying to get out of this pattern of behavior, both reach out to each other and reach out to people of color, and African Americans in particular, and express ourselves, we are, breaking the gaslighting. And the gaslighting is I think, a very important but minor part of what it's a very low level. It's not minor. It's kind of the grounding of a lot of the, anyway. So I do think that your experience is of feeling, gee, I just don't know what's going on, is an experience of that we ought to raise to a level of solidarity, of empathy.
Yeah, and if I can just add a couple of things. One is that when I spoke to the dad, he said he was trying to keep it at, this was a prank, a one-time incident, it won't happen again. And then what he said to me was, but these are sensitive times.
Yeah.
And he didn't spell it out, but I think I understood what he was saying.
Yeah.
And then he said his wife kind of took a different view. And since I know what she wrote to a neighborhood listserv, I didn't blame her for feeling as upset as she clearly was. I think she had every right to be. I will also add that both the dad and the mom via the listserv did say that a lot of people in the neighborhood spoke up, saying how sorry they were that this happened. and being supportive in the sense of, we don't like it that this happened. I don't know that anybody addressed it as a racial issue. And I don't know. I mean, like I said, my first impulse was to think this is because they're Black and living in a white neighborhood. And then just thinking, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know there have been some other things that have happened in the neighborhood that targeted, for instance, two white guys who lived together and were partners to each other. So based on that, it's easier for me to think people are being targeted sometimes for their difference.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it made me also want to do what I could to keep an extra eye out for my neighbors. And, just kind of, because I walk a lot, just to be extra aware of what happens around their house. What cars come by, do people stop or whatever. So anyway, I'll turn it back to you.
No, I think that what you were doing was not simply expressing a feeling, but you were resolving to do an action, which I think it gets beyond simple sentiments of, gee, I'm sorry this happened to you, to say, I am taking measures,
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as saying, to act as a good neighbor,
Yeah, right.
to watch out for your neighbors, and so I think that's certainly something that might go on the neighborhood Facebook page. If you want to go into it a little bit further about what the woman of the household said in more detail, or if that's not something to.
I think I'm reluctant to do that because I don't want to do too many things that identify who it might be.
Right, yeah.
That feels like it maybe is an invasion of privacy somehow. I feel a little on edge about even this degree. Yeah. So if you'll forgive me, I think that's where I'll leave it.
Right.
She was not rude to anyone, but she was very strong in stating that people should have come to her if they had a problem with her.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times the people who are doing this kind of stuff may be pretty marginal themselves.
Yeah.
Be teenagers. I mean, it's with some sense of lack of proportion, anyway, let's leave it at that. I mean,
and I'll just say, if it was a prank, and let's be generous and say it was teenagers who aren't very mature, then that's part of the problem with what we're talking about solidarity, about what white people do and don't do. Because if it was teenagers, it was almost certain to be white teenagers.
Yeah.
And that means that they are really insensitive, if it were white teenagers, to what the impact is of doing something like that to a family who's Black and no other family got that treatment on the street.
Yeah.
And
that's precisely the point, is that we can see some of these things in yes, they emphasize or highlight the vulnerability, of a Black family living in a predominantly white neighborhood. At the same time, and the other thing that seems to me to be, because I feel that it's really important to think about the hidden costs of doing that kind of thing. When you're thinking and acting white, when you're acting off of that kind of and among them are the ways in which that's you can't say infantile, but puerile. It's an immature, reaction. And I'm glad that you brought up at least that little bit of the wife's, what do you call it? Statement, because that's right. If you have a problem with me, come and talk to me directly. Right. That's what human beings do,
right,
with each other. And this other stuff is just it's corrupting. I mean, it's really corrupting for human relations. And what you're doing, and when you're doing that, is you're building in a set of habits, which are cowardly, and break the bonds of intimacy and connection, solidarity, beloved community that we know are the basis, the grounding for our leading full and rich lives. So there's a lot of hurt, that self-inflicted harm. And the other thing that I would point out from that is that this really, the personal is political was the old, expression from the women's movement, but the political is personal also. The other way around. And this kind of personal behavior really has political implications.
Yeah, it does.
And it's not simply, towards the Black family. It's this. It's the trying to strengthen the bonds of the so-called white race. Every action like this is transgressive on one level of our humanness, but it's at the same time it becomes a highly corrosive and corrupting way in which white people, people who think and act white, get together, right, and exclude everyone else. So it's reinforcing all of that by action, the thinking and acting white realm, and so it really does have significant power relation, power implications, and so power over as opposed to power with.
Well, and part of what this is making me think about, and sorry, I'm getting some feedback to make it confusing. Part of what I'm thinking about is that by doing it as an anonymous act, the way that it was done, not only did it interrupt a social contract between my neighbor and whoever did that, so that it reduced it to something as that I would say at minimum was immature. But if there was a racial component to it, as you say, it's reinforcing whatever the social circles are for the person who did it. It's also interrupting the capacity of the social circles of white people in my neighborhood. They could tell the family they were sorry about what happened, but they can't say anything to the white person because we don't know who it was and we don't know the circumstances of it. And, right. And my suspicion is, knowing most of my neighbors reasonably well on the street, that they'd have been willing to stand up and say something a lot stronger to whoever did it, not just saying supportive things to the neighbors of I'm sorry, but they would have been willing to speak up. But now how can they? We don't know who to speak up to.
Yeah, and here again, I think how that's done, is really important, as well. We can't reinforce the same patterns.
Right.
We have to reach out to people and ask them, people who commit those kind of behaviors, and really try. I mean, it's not easy to not pass judgment, but to actually listen, to what they're thinking, because in a lot of cases, just allowing them to express themselves will point out, I mean, it's something low level and silly and pranky, and puerile, as I say, like this, the shame may kick in, and they will, they could be really aware of this. I think of this in terms of, I have, these stories of racial encounters, and I think of it in a workplace and how corrosive it is to workplace solidarity when there's there's somebody who is, mistreating, a fellow worker, or even more the case when it's a supervisor or somebody in a position of power who uses their power over people, that are there, that work for them,
right.
In a bullying way. And the only response to that is solidarity.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, bullies, people in general don't stand up to bullies, and racial bullying or gender bullying or same-sex, bullying is one of the ways in which workplaces work, right? I mean,
right.
for, to maintain, dominance, and the owner or the person who's in charge delegates, deputizes these lower level subordinates, and they use this kind of thing, and it makes workplaces hell, right? I mean, I mean, it really makes it hard to get up and go to work in the morning. So, and when it's racial, the intimidation is even greater, racial or gender or any of these other, targeted groups, because then if you're European American, you're even more afraid to act in solidarity, because you think you'll be isolated and treated, the same way as the targeted person is. And all I can say to that is, rather that than continue this, harassment and bullying, which affects all of the workers in the office or factory or whatever it is. So you can really see the class dynamics of it, when you put it into a workplace setting. There really is a class dynamic to this, and the only solution to it is solidarity, is really, collectively standing up and saying, this is unacceptable. You treat us, like all of us, the same, and all of us with respect, right?
Yeah. So at this point, I'd like to reference a conversation that we actually had elsewhere a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. And you were talking about solidarity. I'm sorry, I'm getting the feedback again. Gosh, that's confusing to listen through.
You're clear on my
on my end, I'm hearing my voice. I think Tamara has just taken care of it. So anyway, you were talking about solidarity, and of course you and I have been having these conversations blessedly. I've really enjoyed them for several years. But you were talking that particular time about solidarity in a way that allowed me to hear it differently. And I should say at this point that I have in recent months spent a fair amount of time in a secular version of Tibetan Buddhist compassion training. And so all of a sudden it was like I heard solidarity in a different way because of that and hearing what you meant by it. I mean, it's like I've understood intellectually what you meant, but it was like then this compassion training and relating it to solidarity made me understand it at a feeling level. And that was that we rely on each other for so much. We rely on all kinds of other people we don't see who help make our lives possible. You know, whoever stocks the shelves in the grocery store, I don't see those people most of the time. I don't see the truckers that bring food in. You know, there are hundreds of people that make my life possible. And part of the purpose of compassion training, which I began to hear as solidarity, is that it matters to me what everybody else experiences in their lives, that I would ideally like it if everybody were treated with respect and with some recognition that we depend on each other a lot, and that it's, I don't know, help me here. I'm trying to articulate it, that it matters to act in solidarity with each other as much as at least in part out of gratitude for the fact that other people help make our lives possible.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I think when you brought that up, drew that connection, I thought it was really a brilliant connection to make. That you know, that there is a lot of you know, ethical and you know, and moral weight to what we're talking about,
Yeah.
and even more so than that, you know, the moral weight is linked to an enlightened self-interest, and you know, that's, I think, you know, the point that you are making. I remember being in college and thinking, sometimes, you know, saying, because I went to a small liberal arts, you know, elite college, that there were, and as a person who came out of a working class and labor union, you know, organizing and radical progressive background, there were a few others of folks like that who were in, you know, who I went to school with.
Mm-hmm.
And we were often trying to emphasize to these other fellow students that there were a whole lot of invisible people.
Yes.
That made it possible for that college to function, you know, and you know, from people who cooked, who worked in the kitchens, to people who were you know, the buildings and grounds folks. This was so long ago that there's a funny story I could tell, which is that
Tell it.
that, well, you know, it's not so funny. I mean, it was a sign of the times, but there were quote maids, you know, who changed the sheets on the beds for in the men's dorms, but not in the women's dorms. This was when they were.
Oh, okay. So we have now a whole other layer in there.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm bringing it up. You know,
it does sound pretty funny.
Yeah, well, it's funny, but it's also, you know, good God, you know, where were we? You know,
right.
Who was figuring this one out? Also, the women had curfews for, you know, the anyway, be that as it may, that really dates me, I'm sure. But it's it was those kind of things that we kept on emphasizing and raising. You know, that even at this place that was super intellectual and, you know, all of this other stuff, you know, it ran on the labor theory of value. You know, that all value comes out of the labor, you know, historical and contemporary labor. You know, that it was working people who built the buildings, you know, and it was working people who kept the place, you know, running. So valuing work, valuing labor, you know, is part of what I was um, very much aware of at a place where people were, super intellectual. So
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead. No,
I was
go ahead.
related to this. I was going to bring in the idea of gratitude for people who are doing these things, and a component of this secular compassion training, which was the gratitude you have for people not causing harm to you. So every day that I go out driving, for instance, and I follow the traffic rules, but not just because they're rules. I do it because it does make everything more orderly in the world, and I don't cause harm to people that way. I don't want to cause harm. And what I've come to think more clearly about, so it's more visible to me, is that people don't want to harm me either. And that may seem like a very baseline kind of level of gratitude to have, the fact that people aren't harming you. But I'm relating this back to what we started with about the incident with the family up the street, that whoever put that poop in the mailbox apparently didn't understand this idea about just the simple gratitude of not harm, of not harming someone, and that their act was harmful, and that I'm just that we're all ideally doing that for each other all the time, that we're at minimum at least not causing harm to each other, even if we may not be doing anything more than that, that's a significant thing too. And that's the incident up the street, I guess, is just an illustration of that. Anyway, I'm fumbling here.
Well, no, that's that really is, as you say, it's the connecting tissue of society, which is why exploitation and oppression are really corrosive. They really. So of course the next discussion to have, now that we've spent all of this time talking about what might be called microaggressions and suggestions of micro solidarities to contradict it, we could talk about the unequal effects of the pandemic, and of course of Ahmaud Arbery, where we're getting into much more, as people, progressives like to call it, structural issues. I always object to that, because the only way that structures and structural racism and institutional racism work is through the actions and behavior of hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people. So we really need to connect institutions with the day-to-day decisions that European Americans in particular make, that are part of this pattern of thinking and acting white. And how do we do something, that where an entire community, not just the African American community of Brunswick, but the entire community, and mostly now even the entire United States, now that the video has gone viral, that has been so traumatized. This is a real trauma. And what do we do to restore? What is a healing process? There are people, European Americans, who are working in Brunswick, to do this kind of healing work, to act in solidarity. And we need to think creatively about what this means. And for me, one of the things that is to just what Ted Allen, the guy who I studied many years with, wrote the book The Invention of the White Race. what he calls just simply resigning from the white race, declaring, I'm not white, I'm a human being. And there seems to be a contradiction between those two. You can either be human or a working person, or you can think and act white and practice a certain kind of set of behaviors that are all too familiar in the South.
Yeah. So what I was thinking about when you were talking was what this distinction you were making between structural racism that you say is really just the result of hundreds and thousands of people making decisions and reinforcing structures. And I was thinking, this is one of those areas where I wonder if white people have a hard time seeing structural racism, partly because if they aren't being personally racist towards someone and they can't really see the structural racism, then it removes their responsibility to do anything about what's in place. Does that generate any thoughts for you?
I think so, and I'm not sure if the way forward, in terms of people of goodwill, European Americans of goodwill, being effective in practicing solidarity or empathy or any of the other ways, or beloved community. These are all, I think, synonyms for what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Without, first of all, on one level, thinking about it in terms of our own interests, right? That this is not something we are doing for someone else. We're doing it for ourselves, mm-hmm. Because we want to live in a certain kind of world, and so that's one part of it. The second part of it is that I'm not sure that I'm not sure even how to express this, but there's something about the way to connect with people who think and act white that's got to be respectful and non not preaching down.
Right.
And to start bringing up this kind of informational stuff about, you're not thinking in terms of institutional racism, or structural racism, and you think it's only this and you think it's only that. I'm not sure that we get anywhere with that. In other words, that becomes ineffective and in some ways counterproductive and polarizing. I don't know how you do this with these folks who are out there, with law, semi-automatic weapons
right.
standing in front of the state capitol buildings and demanding, that the place open up.
Right.
I mean, that the state, that the governor, open up the state, or it's hard to figure out where to go with this, but historically, I didn't print this out, the email that I sent to you about this cycle, mm-hmm. This historic cycle that we enter into, and I'm hesitant to just say it without having Ted Allen's words in front of me, but this idea that the country goes through these cycles of crisis and resolution, in which one of the things that the central feature of it that Ted talks about is that as things as the economy enters into a bust period, the material advantages of being part of the white race tend to erode. And it's at that point that European Americans start to get religion. They feel like, they're going to, work more in solidarity with people of color, because, they recognize that that's really the only way to get out of the crisis and not have it put on their backs. Yeah. But what Ted says is that at that point, the ruling elites are able to redesign and reorganize the racial privilege system. And always in the past, European Americans have taken the bait, and they've, whatever word you want to use, thrown the black people under the bus, and we can see this incredibly clearly in all of the reforms of the New Deal period, in which, because the Dixiecrats were in such a powerful position within the Democratic Party, were designed to reinforce racial privilege. So Social Security did not include the vast majority of Black and Latinx, Hispanic working people, because they were domestic workers and particularly agricultural workers were excluded for 20 years or more, and all of the rights to form unions, the National Labor Relations Act, things like that, did not include any non-discrimination clauses, in the law. They were stripped out by the Dixiecrats. So what that meant was that that labor unions could discriminate, and they already were discriminatory. Many of the old American Federation of Labor Unions were whites only. It was written into their constitutions. So, and even the CIO, there was no vehicle for this new industrial union movement to have federal backing for changing relationships. Those things really only began with the Civil Rights Acts in the mid 60s. And then you get lawsuit after lawsuit by Black workers saying that the unions, it's not just the bosses, the corporations that are discriminating against us, it's the unions. So how do you have solidarity? How do you have workers' power when you're talking about solidarity, but what you really mean is white top and black bottom? It's not equal. If you don't have equality, if you're not fighting for equality, then you're weakening your own. You're shooting yourself in the foot.
And what you're talking about here is one of the things that I get frustrated with when I have some of these. Getting the food back again. I'm sorry. It's just really hard. I'm hearing an echo of myself.
Yeah. Maybe take out your earphones.
I can try.
Oh, you're mute. Now you're still mute.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm not hearing myself, thank goodness. I don't mind that much hearing myself, but two of me talking over each other. Anyway, what I was thinking about is this lag between what happened with Social Security and these other benefits and the Dixiecrats. This is something, because I've learned to articulate this better when I'm talking to white people. I bring this up now sometimes with white people who don't think they're racist and don't really see that there's any kind of systemic inequality. And this also becomes proof to them that it's all in the past, that Black people do get Social Security now. And, some of these other kinds of things are available. So it's all equal is sort of the impression that I get. And I haven't yet figured out myself in those conversations, what is the next level I need to go to when I find myself in one of those conversations. I've sometimes tried to push it a little bit and I told you about one of these things, and I have reasons for not wanting to go into a lot of details, but that I pulled back and I said, what I want to do is talk about what I would like to see for my fellow human beings. And I won't say that necessarily completely altered the conversation, but it kept me from feeling angry. And it kept me from feeling like I was exhausting myself trying to say something. So it had some value on that level. But I still am not sure how to proceed from there, how to move it even a little bit more to, can you see what you want for your fellow human beings? Do you want this kind of inequality? Can you see this inequality? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm struggling with this. I mean, it's wonderful to have these conversations with you because of two things. One of which I think you're really thinking and you're thinking outside the box of thinking and acting white. Right?
I'm trying to.
and that's all that any of us can do. And we're subject to the blind spots, that our limited experience, gives us. But on the other hand, we are also doing this work without having Black people having to hold our hands,
Right. That's true.
Which is no matter how we do, that's an act of solidarity.
Yeah.
Ironically, and it also, I think, reinforces the sense of autonomy. That we can think these things through. And the other thing is, I think we really need to think about these issues as something that we're thinking about, not to do something for someone else, but as our own enlightened self-interest, and be able to bring that, to communicate that with other European Americans. So it seems to me there's two levels. One of which is the connection, which the idea that you were making, and I. That what you would like for everyone in the world is what you want is the way to draw the connection with the other person, and I mean, there are a lot of people who are going to reject that.
That's probably true.
The idea that that everybody should be safe and have healthcare coverage, and a secure place to live, and access to education. I mean, there are a lot of people, that for whom hierarchy is the way to go. And no, there are deserving folks and there are undeserving folks, and that really is pretty deeply grounded in a certain kind of Christianity, in a certain kind of political and economic, thinking, and that's one of the reasons why this situation with the pandemic, with the COVID 19 spreading has been interesting to see how both the acts of solidarity and the limits of it, because New York City coming out at 7:00 at night, and clapping is one thing, but there really the question of how you fight to protect these folks, is and we know that there's overwhelming support for the measures, that are in place.
Mm-hmm.
Mask wearing, social distancing, and not going back to work too soon, listening to the scientists, all that other stuff. But there's still folks out there who just don't get it, and and a whole powerful, financial and political network that is ginning them up, and producing much more visibility than they warrant in terms of the attitudes, things like that. But there's so much of that is on the level of emotional grounding, is really part of the same pattern, that of white supremacy.
Yeah.
So how we approach this question of if you want it for everybody, and you're European American, how do you exclude someone who is not white, right? That's the the question, and I guess I'm kind of wandering down a path here that I think is not as productive as maybe pulling back and talking about the specifics of politics and economics, because one of the things that we need to think about and inform ourselves about is all of the ways in which those old forms of racial discrimination have been transformed into new forms.
Yeah.
And ones in which it's much less visible to European Americans of what's going on. I mean, housing differences and hyper incarceration, focused criminal incarceration. Mm-hmm. We need to be able to bring up those issues in a way that helps people to understand. And that really requires studying and developing discussion points,
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of them that we could think about, about the ways in which racial privilege becomes a hidden cost for European Americans that maybe they don't think about. So I see Tamara's come back.
Yes, I see Tamara too.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Are we doing Egberto today, or are we just have you just come back to keep us company?
I'm just so glad, David, that we can have these kind of conversations. Yeah. I'm just, being able to talk about the issues that divide us. It's uncomfortable for a lot of people, but I just appreciate you and Nina so much. I love you guys so much because, not many people are willing to do this and have these kind of conversations. So I thank you for that.
Well, I think
go ahead.
I think it's healing for for all of us. However uncomfortable it may make European Americans. I mean, thinking and acting white is not in your interest. As a human being, as a working person. So, being in some discomfort, emotional discomfort, that's part of growing up, and if you're uncomfortable about this and you're my age, there's some growth that you need to do, and that's in your interest, to do that, to reach
and maybe, is it painful? Like, I mean, yeah. As a Black person looking at somebody, that is uncomfortable with this kind of conversation, is it painful? Is it a sense of pain? What is it that they're holding on to, David and Nina? What is it, Nina, that they're holding on
to?
can't let go of.
My sense is when I run into some of these conversations with white people is that it creates confusion. Like, if you can see the world as a hierarchy, the way David was mentioning a few minutes ago, where there are people who are deserving who are on top and people who are not deserving on the bottom, and it's all kind of neatly sorted out, then if there's something that begins chipping away at that, it creates confusion, is what it looks like to me it creates. So then it's like the world isn't what I thought that it was, and I don't know where to put that. And it means I'm going to have to rethink a whole bunch of other things, and I don't want to have to deal with that. I mean,
and
that's kind of.
And they may have been wrong. Do you think that's part of it, Nina?
That probably is part of it. I think most human beings just generally don't like being wrong and don't like being put on the spot and making, I don't mean that somebody makes them feel wrong, but of realizing they've made a mistake. I don't like knowing that I've made mistakes, but, I accept that happens, and I try to accept that as graciously as I can.
Well, here's the thing. One of the things, Nina, if I could interrupt you.
Sure.
I tend to look at this in terms of paradigms. A paradigm is a mental map of the world,
right,
that people have. And if you're listening to the world from a certain perspective, and Fox News, I think I don't watch it. I break out in hives. Too much.
For good reason.
But the little glimpses that I get from the sound bites that are sometimes on MSNBC and places like that, and the language that I hear from white working folks around me, is that we're really talking about paradigms. And so when you try to feed information that into a person who's got a paradigm that's inimical to that information, it becomes very disturbing, right? It's the confusion. And if you start out, I have this with a what do you call it, a home repair guy, let me put it that way, who came to my house, who was very sharp, very smart, really knew what he was talking about, and very full of himself, because he thought he had it all right. And I raised this with him because he understood when I said, well, this is really not simply about facts. This is about paradigms. He knew what I was saying. And it really, I could see that it caught him up short. He was really trying to process that. And if we could start out with an understanding that the Fox News talk, right-wing talk radio has built up a whole set of of factual connections for people that are mutually reinforcing, and which they've created a whole worldview, a paradigm for themselves.
Right.
You're not going to break through that
not easily.
Confronting them with facts, right? There has to be, first of all, a human connection, because we don't think rationally. None of us think rationally, except for Tamara.
No.
No, I'm being so. But none of us think. First of all, think rationally. The brain is an instrument for survival, and it has fast thinking and slow thinking. And those people who put slow thinking first, they didn't survive, back, 500,000 years ago, or whatever it was when Homo sapiens began. If you saw a rustle in the grass, get out of the way.
Yeah.
That's the way you survived. So we have to, but that kind of thinking really doesn't help when the rustle in the grass is a set of code words, about immigrants creating, spreading disease or something like that. So we need to learn how to slow down our thinking. You know, we need to learn to listen to other people's paradigms, you know, and at the same time, learn to, I mean, I think the hardest thing for people like you and me, Nina, is to be able to be present for the European Americans who are aggressively, you know, spouting stuff that makes us uncomfortable, you know.
Yep. And it happens to me, and I've been struggling for years to figure out what is the right thing to say at this point.
Yeah. And so much of that, I think, really has to be done collectively. Mm-hmm. We really need to build support groups where we can bring I heard this the other day in my office or in my, you know, from my neighbor. What do I say about it? I know we're running a little over, but I was at one of these Decatur dinners, you know, the consciousness raising, you know, community dinners that were going around until we, you know, no longer can do them. Yeah. But there was a guy who was talking about having a Black Lives Matter. He was, you know, European American, who put a Black Lives Matter sign in his front yard, and there was a really hostile response from one of his neighbors. Mm-hmm. And there was one Black person present at that dinner, and she said, you know, we really need to simply say that ask those people why they are reading that sign as being only Black Lives Matter instead of Black Lives Matter too.
Good point.
You know,
and on that note, David, we are at the top of the hour. Yeah. I want to thank Miss Nina. Nina, I love you. I appreciate you.
I love you too. And I really I appreciate being able to do this from time to time.
Yes, we enjoy having you. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Okay.
Yeah.
My trusty co-host, Howard to
Okay.
Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.